I'll introduce today's keynote speaker. It's Dr. Eliot McIntire, and he got his PhD from the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Forestry, working on forest fires and mountain pine beetle in southern BC. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Montana in wildlife biology and held a Canada Research Chair in forest modeling in the Faculty of Forestry at Laval University. In 2011, he moved back to BC to work at the Canadian Forest Service as a research scientist. And the diversity of topics that he's worked on has led him to his current research that he will present on today, which is about building tools that can connect people and science across disciplines and policy spheres. And that's interesting because I've heard a lot of discussion today about that connection between science and policy. And the need for science to inform our decision making on forest management. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. The title is Bringing Open Science, Open Models, and Nimbleness to Forest Ecology and Land Management. And with that, I give you Eliot McIntire.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you very much for this invitation and this opportunity to speak at NAFEW 2022 conference. It's a great pleasure. I would first like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory my home and office stand, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. As we know, ecosystems worldwide are being subjected to various climate change drivers coming from gradual climate change, changes in the patterns of extreme events, changes in land use with associated habitat loss. All of these are causing a major biodiversity crisis and ecological shifts that have been reported by many across the globe. But that doesn't mean we know exactly how to bring ecology to policy and management. The literature has suggested lots of ideas, but these include model and data transparency, the reproducibility and iterative updating of forecasts. I'm going to go over some of these today, because some of those may be new terms. But I'm also going to add some key elements that in our experience are still missing. This is the overall outline of my talk. Start with prediction and forecasting to really situate what I'm going to be talking about. And then introduce this concept we labeled perfect and how it leads to nimble management and open science. And then I'm going to walk through some case studies which are both published and in review. And then I'm going to go forward from all of this stuff. What do we do with all this? Obviously, prediction and forecasting are related, but I wanted to bring these two words together in one slide because they are slightly different. Prediction is about estimating something given new conditions. So that could be something like predicting tree growth rate at a nearby location that wasn't measured. More generally, from statistical models, it could be basically new covariate values. And we want to find out what our model tells us or predicts would be the new value from our model. Forecasting, like what we see in this animation here, is about prediction into the future. So this is just, forecasted above ground temperatures. I'm just seeing chats go by. And so forecasting can have uncertainty or probability statements associated with it, but they don't necessarily have to have them. What's important about forecasting is that it is imperfect. Indeed, thanks to weather forecasts that have been happening and improving for more than 2,000 years, we know in part what it takes to deal with some of this uncertainty and then to improve our forecasting. And one of the things that it takes is we need to repeat, update forecasts regularly with new data, new improved models, new areas, new information, and unexpected events. And as we see in a weather forecast, we get that sense, we understand that forecasts vary in quality, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But I want to talk, the iterative near-term ecological forecasting has been a thing in the literature for the past 5 or so years, which is basically saying, bring these tools that are in other disciplines into ecology. The forecast
Eliot,
for...
sorry, yeah. Can I interrupt you for just one second? We seem to be having a a problem with some background noise that only some people are hearing.
Okay.
So I don't fully understand. So if you are on the call, if you're still in Gather, could you please shut your mics off? I think the webinar, everyone should be shut, but if you left your mic on in Gather, that might be causing the problem. And if you're having a phone conversation, if you could go in another room, that would also be helpful. Let's hope that solves the problem. Sorry for the interruption, Eliot.
Okay. You just interrupt again because I'm not hearing anything. So.
Okay.
Okay. So back to this slide about the forecast horizon. When we see a weather forecast, we each have an intuitive understanding of what it means to have a forecast horizon. The idea is that the further into the future we look, the less likely our forecast is to be reliable. And so we should weight it less. In the context of forest applications, this allows us to inform action within a decision to risk framework if we bring this type of forecast horizon perspective with it. This book in 2015 called Super Forecasting was I want to do an aside to this because it was the culmination of many decades of work about how do we improve our forecasts. And there are some key findings here that are very relevant to ecology. The first one is that experts were no better than the overall population at forecasting, in this case, geopolitical futures. The second point is that not everyone is equally bad. There were super forecasters, and these were people who were dispassionate, had no consequences if their forecasts are wrong, and it wasn't a personal affront if their forecasts were bad. They didn't try to defend or describe how good their forecasts are. It was just that day in and day out, they collected data, made forecasts, updated their models, and iterate again. And all this meant that the process of developing a forecast for us, for ecologists, needs to be lightweight so that we don't get too attached. We need to be able to see forecasts and our models as things that are disposable and we can move to the next one or improve it. We need to be nimble so that we can achieve some of the best forecasting that we can. Why is forecasting important? Well, it can help us with planning, help with decision-making, help anticipating changes. It's a good way to translate abstract model outputs like covariates to decision-making points. It can do things like help evaluate trade-offs, including with economics or other values. We still have a long way to go to link most decision-making with ecological forecasts, as Lisa and the conference has noted. And I was part of this effort recently to identify what it might take to bridge that divide between ecological forecasts and environmental decision-making. And we put together this figure about how engaged the different scientists are with this idea of bringing forecast to environmental decision-making. And this can just help us frame where we are as scientists and what our contributions are to this space. In order to get better at forecasting, one tool is called forecasting challenges. So the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, which I have linked here, has created these challenges where you can just click on these and start to use the data that are part of each of these projects and develop forecasts to try and then compare your forecast to new data as it's streaming in from these NEON networks in the United States. And this is happening right now, and it's a very useful way, good practice for applications. There's a newish Canadian branch of the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, and we are starting to think about supporting forecasting challenges within the Canadian context. I've highlighted a bunch of things so far, but these forecasting challenges are good for these cases where the data are available and in rapid streams. But most of the decision-making in forests doesn't qualify. We don't have that kind of data. We have complexity of different types of things from assisted migration and pests and fires. We have multiple disciplines with silos where we don't necessarily interact with each other. We don't always evaluate richly like we do in a forecasting challenge our models over and over and over again and see how we can improve them. And often we are not actually reproducible. And this last one here is, if we can't reproduce our results precisely every time under any situation, why should we convince land managers to use our science? And so see, some of these challenges are where we're we're headed. So I'm going to jump through to this next stage, which is this perfect approach. What we discovered when we saw all those challenges and we were working through problems, that they are not necessarily independent of one another. Whenever we tried to deal with one of these two different challenges, it impacted the other challenges. So we put this reality together in this perfect approach: predict regularly, evaluate reusable, freely available, and interoperable models within continuous workflows that are tested automatically. And together, these create a nimbleness. I'm going to dive a little bit into three of these: reusability, freely available, and interoperable, the middle three there. And we'll go from that. Many of you will already have a notion of reusability, namely through sharing of code in packages like R packages or something. If everybody would do this, we would be a long way toward widespread reusability. However, the functions, like on the left-hand side with these Legos, are like the building blocks for building a Lego city. Of course, we can build a giant city from the ground up from the raw building blocks. But if we could do this in parallel, where different groups are working towards, with different collections of structures like modules, then we could arrive more quickly at a city. It also enables less specialized ecologists to build integrated projects that answer novel questions, because we can build, we can take this house that was already created and put it into a new context. I'm going to try to visualize interoperability. Interoperability is when the connecting across disciplines or studies or paradigms is not a hurdle. Here I've represented 20 different modules that each does a different thing. Many of these are forecasting modules, but not all. Interoperability allows us to mix and match horizontally across these topics and also vertically within pipelines. And I'll show those 2 points. One can imagine if there is a project about caribou demographics. In forecasting caribou demographics, we might need to forecast the landscape, which has fires and harvesting and anthropogenic development, vegetation that's climate sensitive, climate, roads, trends. We might have a slightly different project, might be different people who are leading it, about caribou habitat forecast. So it's subtly different than demographics, but it's different. So we could remove that one piece about caribou demographics and add the habitat part, but the rest we can just reuse because it is all still relevant. We might then weave in Indigenous knowledge, and we can keep on with the other pieces. Or we can change to a completely different topic, like carbon budgets under climate change. And even though it looks like it's a completely different topic, there's still 4 of these components that we were able to reuse for a totally different question. Hopefully you watched me connect those hexagons and you had strong doubts about how ecological models can just move from one project to another. Aren't parameters and components idiosyncratic? And yes, of course they are. The real reason this might work is what is happening behind those hexagons. So those hexagons are showing the horizontal cross-disciplinary components. What is hidden in those figures is the within discipline data analytics forecasting pipelines that would look more like this. So that vegetation hexagon would have several other modules that would be preparing things like the permanent sample plot, data fetching and estimation of parameters. And another one that gets climate sensitive growth deviations, collecting climate data and yield curves, bringing those together into growth parameters here. And then another module that brings forest inventory and estimates above ground biomass. And that is what both of those together get brought into the vegetation module, which is the thing we showed in the previous. I'm going to briefly touch on how we do this. we created a family of R packages that facilitates the building of arbitrary data model components. So we took the programming language that most ecologists already know, namely R. SPADES is the Spatial Discrete Event System. It's an R meta package. R has interfaces to many other languages, and this is very important because people can write content or models or whatever in different languages, and R can access them. We have already written Python, Java, C++ modules that have been integrated. Projects are composed of interacting modules, and modules communicate via common data. And then, as I've shown, every step from the raw data to eventual outputs is modularized. Moving on to the third element of perfect that I want to talk about, freely available is more than just open source. It also means understandable and usable by the community. Similarly, it's more than just open data. Really, it's about an entire open science. And open science, obviously, there can be many definitions of what this means, but it has, certainly has to have components of open data, open software, open models, and with co-production and open engagement with diversity of knowledge types. And this is not easy to do with our traditional training and tools. This is a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to do two, before I get into my actual case studies, I just want to talk briefly, present two examples of what some of this would be in a concrete way. So let's say, for example, the British Columbia government is working on a real-time fire forecast during the fire season. They might collect data, first step. Second step, clean the data, estimate new values for inputs, enter them into their fire model, run their model to forecast, visualize, and then set up prioritization of where to attack the fire. Step one, we could call the open data part. Step 5 would be open model. What about steps 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7? These are sort of in-between parts, or parts that we think of as sort of external, but they are very relevant. So what if Alberta, the neighboring province, neighboring jurisdiction, their fire management follows a very similar strategy as these 7 steps? In an open science world, not only could they use the same step 5, the same Prometheus model, which they do currently, they would also be able to look at or reuse steps 2, 3, 4, 6, and 7, because they would be open as well. This would increase the amount of reusability. BC government efforts could further help Alberta government, and then any customizations required would be marginal to this. And so we don't have to reinvent the whole wheel of all of these steps each time we go to a new jurisdiction. A second hypothetical example, let's say the Canadian Forest Service has a new program called 2 Billion Trees, which we do. And we did create a web app to support this program and delivery. It's about understanding carbon and planting trees to help the carbon budgets. Maybe British Columbia likes this program, this 2 Billion Trees program, and they have an objective in their carbon program that is similar. And they want to use this app, but it's not quite right. It does a lot of the things right, but not everything. So they might choose to reuse the app in a modular world with interoperable, freely available stuff. They might be able to reuse 90% of the app being done already, and only 10% needs customizing. This is a huge reduction in marginal costs and marginal time needed. All right, I'm going to jump to these case studies now. Several of these are published and in review, and they all come from one project that I'm going to introduce very briefly. These case studies fit within the pan-Canadian approach to transforming species at risk conservation in Canada, which is a major policy at the federal government level. It's a strategy for addressing species at risk, and it is challenging some of the science and scientists to do more than what has been done in the past, because it requires that they deal with multiple species, multiple economic actors, multiple stressors, multiple rights holders, such as Indigenous and government, Indigenous communities and governments. We attempted to address this in Western Canada. The study area. We actually began with a smaller one in 2019 in that sort of the darker part of this map in Northwest Territories. And we expanded it to the entire green area here, which is the Western boreal forest of Canada. And so this project just concluded a few months ago. Yeah. Our first case study is about the Indigenous knowledge and forecasting. And this is very much a work in progress. So the conclusions here are not really conclusions yet because it is a long-term effort. I show on the top right here, we pre-published the methods about how we're planning on engaging with Indigenous knowledge prior to our actual study, so that the journal can determine or to accept or reject based on the methodology, not the final results. And in this case study, we identified that there is a shared vision of conservation amongst all affected groups, that we want to protect boreal caribou populations and simultaneously head towards reconciliation. Next, we had to understand how to create connections between Western science models and Indigenous knowledge. So we did this literature review of weaving Indigenous knowledge with Western science forecasting and other models. We then also set up community workshops in 5 regions of Northwest Territories. This was supposed to happen more or less at the beginning of 2020. And some of you have noticed that there was a pandemic. And so everything got pushed majorly back. But we have started now, but much delayed, to gather feedback from the Dene leaders, elders, and youth of the community about what co-production of knowledge would look like. And then if it is approved by these participants, to start planning potential next steps to determine how might be the best approach to co-produce an Indigenous knowledge-based caribou module to help implement the Western Boreal Initiative. The second case study is about forecasting trees and wildfires, and this is based on a large number of publications, some of which I've showed here, including one that's currently in review that's really talking about the methodology, this iterative methodology, and this data pipeline. I'm going to show results of the trees and the fire by each of these jurisdictions separately. It'll be hopefully fairly clear as I'm doing that. And what we're doing is forecasting over the next century under climate change and vegetation and fire change. The first thing to show is these drought forecasts, which have the potential, of course, to affect almost every aspect of the other forecasts that I'm gonna start to show you about fires and birds and whatever else. So each of these plots has time on the x-axis from the present or just before the present to about the year 2100. Red is the historical drought data for each of these jurisdictions, and blue is the projected drought with confidence intervals. Somewhat surprisingly, in the north, these 2 figures in the north, the projected drought is less intense than in the south, and some of these southern ones, especially the bottom right 3, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, show some fairly serious increases in drought coming. Oops. This slide shows a very similar structure, but now it's about wildfires themselves. Red is annual area burned across this forecast across the century. Number of fires is blue, and average fire size is yellow. And we can see that more or less every place is going up, but not quite everywhere. And there are some clear examples of severe increases in annual area burned that might be driven by increases in average fire size, or they might be driven by increases in number of fires. This figure shows forest cover change between today and the end of the century. And red shows the conversion to conifers in each of these places, and blue shows conversion to deciduous. The main point here is obviously that there's variation and it's not the same everywhere. And it will depend on the particular forecasted climate and fire dynamics that are happening here. And in some cases, there are stronger trends regionally, like this Saskatchewan shows a fairly strong conversion to conifer, and some of this Northwest Territories is showing more conversion towards deciduous. Moving to the insect case study, this one required that we had to develop a completely new hexagon in this top right space here for mountain pine beetle, as there was no existing spatiotemporal population model that would create forecasts. I'm just going to briefly show some of this model. The figure shows an example of 11 years of mountain pine beetle outbreak from the top left going right, occurring and spreading to the surrounding areas. This primarily demonstrates that the spatial spread is heterogeneous and progresses contagiously over time, creating new patchiness that depends in part on the underlying forest cover. I want to bring us back to this forecast horizon idea. So if we remember the weather forecasts, this plot here is a demonstration of what our forecast horizon looks like. So on the x-axis is the forecasted years into the future, and it's a rolling window. We had data from 2010 to 2020 every year. So at the year 2, we could be looking at the change from 2010 to 2012, and also 2011 to 2013, 2012 to 2014, et cetera. So we have a lot of these 2-year forecast horizons, and we have only one 10-year forecast horizon. That's the 2010 to 2020. The first point I want to show here is that we actually had fairly similar overall quality over the 10 years. Presumably, if we had gone further out, then the forecast would decline. But the second point is that there's much more variation in the short term, which was sort of counter to our expectations. So what it suggests is that it might be difficult to precisely predict next year, likely because of specific winter fluctuations, but averaged over 10 years, we're actually just as good as the average of the first year, second year, third year, fifth year, et cetera. So this was quite helpful. Knowing our forecast horizon quality, we could then present this decade out 2030 forecast of probability of mass attack. These results have been shared with the Alberta government, and we'll be working with them to implement this within their mountain pine beetle management strategy. Next, I'll show how the hexagons start to work even more together, more horizontal interoperability, and recalling that each of these hexagons has a whole data pipeline behind it, which I briefly showed for just vegetation, but all the others have it as well. First, we added Landbirds, so this purple one here. We worked with the boreal avian modeling scientists to create their hexagon, i.e. an interoperable version of their models. So these are forecasts of 115 bird species. I think these figures only show about 67. So we produce species level forecast with uncertainty based on these other hexagons, the firs, the trees, the climate, and the bird models together. And the results show different jurisdictions will have different winners and losers. The blue is where there's an increase over the century. The pinkish is where there's a decrease over the century. And the specifics will matter to each of these jurisdictions, especially when it comes to species at risk. Moving to the next case study, we added caribou demographics hexagon. So we took away that purple bird one and we just added this yellow caribou one. And it creates population forecasts using the Environment and Climate Change Canada models for adult female survival and reproduction, resulting in a lambda and a forecast of lambda. And I'm just going to be brief on this one, just to show one key but major result, namely which populations are in a continuing state of decline through the century by jurisdiction. Some of these populations are not these results are not surprising given the current state of these populations, but there are some nuances that will be informative and help in decision-making. Now I'd like to go out even another level of interoperable. We're going to bring in both the birds and the caribou and those other pieces. We evaluate the concept of the umbrella species. So do actions done for caribou have trickle-down effects on landbirds? This is currently in review at Conservation Biology. The take-home result, to dive straight into that, is caribou are actually a relatively poor umbrella species for landbirds for a given amount of area. So to demonstrate this, the figures here, we've got on the x-axis of the larger figure is species groups. So conifer is the pink, deciduous specialists, birds are in the sort of golden color, generalists, etc. across. And on the y-axis is the umbrella index, and it crosses 0, which is near the top there. If the plot is below 0, then identifying the protection based on caribou was actually worse than random. And above 0 means that protecting based on caribou was better than random. On the right-hand side, it's essentially the same figure, but with individual species. So we can tease apart which ones are better and which ones are worse. And so when it comes to species at risk, for example, that specificity will matter. But the important point here is that this is quite a contradictory result to what is currently believed about caribou. And the difference is not, I don't believe there's an actual contradiction in the result. It's more about what we considered as the alternative. I said here for a given amount of area, and that's an important deviation from the original notion of an umbrella species that began many years ago. Namely, the issue about protection today is not really about should we protect. We have some policy frameworks like 25% by 2025 or 30 by 30. So we will be protecting something. And the issue now is about what should we protect, what areas. And in this policy space, protecting based on caribou will underperform for landbird conservation, according to this study. And I'm going to be brief on this last case study here. We did a web application. This initial app is a place where results, data, modules can be accessed, and engagement can occur more easily. Because it's a web-based application, we can keep it evergreen. If modules are updated, then the content can be updated. And this is the web URL for this. It's not a very friendly web URL yet, because it really is a proof of concept that we're sort of working with. And of course, there is a lot more to come as we learn and evolve what is effective in communicating and working with people outside of the scientific community. All right, I have about 5 more slides to try to conclude about where we're going forward. I presented some concepts and their implementation, the perfect approach and their implementation within a framework called SPADES. SPADES is a platform that can help bring open science to land management, as suggested by my talk title today. SPADES is not a model. This is an important distinction that some people don't necessarily get at the first time they hear this. It's a system where models interact. We know of at least 70 modules right now, and these are both these modules fit within a vertical, but also in the horizontal spaces of many different disciplines, but also pipelines that may be useful within a discipline, or sometimes they're shareable across disciplines if they might be doing some GIS application. And I've listed a few notable modules here, like the carbon budget model of the Canadian forest sector, Trisect for spruce budworm, mountain pine beetle, fire. There are 3 models of fire we can compare and do ensemble modeling. Caribou, protected areas, roads, WS3 is harvest optimization, birds, vegetation. We did use all of these in the Western Boreal Initiative, but I didn't show all these results that were coming from all of these, in part because some of the projects the results to date weren't as wrapped up and clean as we would like yet. They're still underway. A critical aspect of bridging forecasting science and land management decision-making, as I showed in that early publication that I was part of, is that the models and data can be accessed in different ways by different people. To date, much of the work has been by these groups here, scientists, modelers, programmers. But the web application development has been helpful to begin the conversations with other groups that are more at the top here. And also the advisory group, which was in the middle space. There were 40 different people in this advisory group of a wide range of backgrounds. In fact, they occurred in all three of these upper spaces of what their roles were. But we were able to address the many different needs of these different groups. And it's still very much, everything is ongoing and continually changing, improving, simplifying, all of the above. In the publication, McIntire et al. 2022, we have a table that talks about lots of benefits. I'm not going to look at that. So I've highlighted this red box as, in my mind, it's one of the most important. And I've rewritten it sort of over here. And it's basically the IPCC has been a really important contribution to the global community. It had a process that had many people involved, a lot of science, and great impact on policy and all sorts of things. But we can't reproduce that whole effort very easily. We don't have the resources. So IPCC-like processes for any problem should be achievable, even when the budgets and the team size doesn't allow it. And this perfect approach with this modularity and interoperability and all the other points of perfect will help to create that. And my last two slides. First is this perfect created this new class of scientists, this integrator scientist. Integrated projects need both disciplinary expertise and integrators. It's also valuable for disciplinary scientists to become aware of the ideas that I've presented here, even if they don't know about whether some integrated project exists or not, and whether they need their science or not. Integrators are always looking for reusable science, and that is more than just tables and publications or ideas from publications. So what we all need to do is either become an integrator, get trained as a student, postdoc, technician, or other, can learn some of the standards that we created, or figure out other ways to implement them. And then wrap your analyses with module metadata and work with an integrator or find an integrator science friend. These all will work. And then within a multi-model forecasting frame, as more science becomes interoperable, we can start to achieve the benefits of having many models do the same, that do the same thing, like forecast spatial wildfire risk. We need many models to do that on every place. And we can do all sorts of things like cumulative effects or ensemble modeling or predictive validation. And I want to just end by saying it would be preposterous to imagine a world with one global circulation model that informed all climate policy globally. We have dozens, and this is really important because, remember, no model is right. George Box said that many years ago. And with that, I would like to conclude and say thank you.
Thanks, Eliot. I'm just having some trouble here accessing my video thing here. Well, I guess I don't need to be seen. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so the floor is open for questions. There's the Q&A at the bottom. There's also chat. And if you'd like to speak out loud to Eliot, just raise your hand and I can access and allow you, unmute you from the participants list. So I'm hoping that the raised hands will go to the top because we have lots of people here today. So just in the chat, we've got a lot of appreciation for your Lego analogy, which is nice. And some comments about genius.
Oh, God.
Yes. And then Nelson says, what a great presentation, Eliot. Thanks very much.
You're welcome, Nelson.
And I'm just going to give people a little bit of time to think. That's a lot to digest, Eliot. I guess I'm going to ask a question in the meantime, because I liked your slide about find an integrator friend. But as someone who is interested in moving some of your ideas east, it does seem like it's a bit of a challenge to find people that can implement this stuff and that have the training, that aren't sort of starting from scratch. So I guess I'm wondering what you think if you see this as a major roadblock right now to growing this thing, because I know these things, you know, it's like anything, right? Like initially it's very slow to build, and then once there's enough momentum, things expand very quickly. But right now it seems like progress is slowed by the fact that there's a lack of expertise. Is that your feeling, and do you see a way around that?
I would say yes, there is that. We used to, for the initial years of when we were developing spades, we were giving workshops, you know, 2 a year, but they were really aimed at a smaller scope than what I presented here. It was really just about helping some, you know, ecological grad student, you know, write some model. And what happened is that as the scope expanded to really being like what I presented here, we haven't yet had the time to update those workshops and the training. So I think that yes, there is a blockage right now. We are working on creating new content about learning this stuff and teaching this stuff. And I think that will be, it will come slowly. We know of a number of groups who figured out how to teach themselves using the online material, and they were just running with it, and it's fine, it works. But yeah, I think it will happen slowly still. We're still getting these publications out. This paper we just got published in Ecology Letters really lays the foundation for all of this stuff. And so there's been quite a bit more, not just interest, but acceptance that these ideas are actually novel enough that it's worth thinking about it.
Okay, thanks. I see that Graham Frank has his hand up, but I cannot seem to access his microphone. I'm wondering if the tech support could help me out with that. And if not, Graham, would you mind typing your question in the Q&A? Sorry about that. This did used to work, but I'm not seeing the microphone pop up here. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A or in the chat right now. I know it's the end of the day, but oh, here's something. From Emily Spenderovac, that was really great. Do you think there will come a point where we become limited by the available data that we can use to create models? There are still some fields, example streams, where it's really difficult to collect enough data to produce any kind of generalized model at the moment.
So I'm going to take that question in a place that Lisa Vanier knows very well, which is a project that we were working on, Lisa was leading, in the Ring of Fire. Essentially what happened is, because of this, you know, we had these models existing that were able to use open data, which it turns out in many cases is not necessarily the highest quality data, but we actually came up to a sort of a complete result for caribou really quickly, really early on in the process, given the available data and these models. And it was incredibly disappointing because, yeah, well, we didn't know quite why at the beginning, but what happened is the models were totally available very quickly to get to a result. And then we could evaluate, oh, is it the data, lack of data, or low quality data that's the problem, or is it the models? And we went through both of those, and the models seemed fine. And we then went to the data, bam, sure enough, it was the data that was just not rich enough in these Northern Ontario places for vegetation, even just the maps of the current vegetation. So I would say we have already shown this situation where the models and the ability to use models sort of outpaced the data. But what the benefit of that was that we could actually identify specific data sources that were the ones that we needed to focus on. So it wasn't just we don't have good quality data on anything. It was actually, these are the sensitive data holes that we need to improve the models. And it was possible that the existing data might have been good enough. And so it was worth going through that relatively nimble exercise of just creating those outputs and saying, okay, are these high quality enough to lead to action or decision or some policy statement right away? And it would be possible, yes, we don't always need the highest quality data for every decision. In fact, we have a paper that's in review that shows that it is not true. We showed Occam's razor in action, where when we needed a simple output, the simple low quality data was actually better, higher quality predictions than the higher quality data and models. So that was like too much information. But on the flip side, when we needed really specific predictions about the tree, the specific species and how much they were going to be in the landscape, we needed the extra complexity of the richer data set. And so when we have a forecasting system, we can evaluate whether the simple data that may be incomplete might be enough for what we need.
Thanks, Eliot. And thanks, Emily, for that question. So Graham has entered his question into the Q&A. So because of a history of colonial knowledge extraction, a lot of Indigenous tribes are hesitant to publicly share their generational knowledge. Can you speak a bit more about how you've worked to weave TEK and open science with these challenges in mind?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I used one or two words that hinted at this reality, which is if the participants agree to participating in this process, then they will, the next step would be this. And this is essentially what you've pointed out. We heard very clearly that the information about caribou from the Indigenous knowledge and the holders of that knowledge was not everybody wanted to share it publicly. And I think that is one reason why the process will be long of weaving Indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge, and that is okay. What I've been able to show today is that the scientific knowledge can advance and be sort of at the table at any time. There's no, it's always sort of close to being ready. We can be very close to giving forecasts using the latest data and whatever. So there's no time sensitivity to the science project, which wouldn't be the case if we weren't doing this interoperability thing. We would have done all of that science and it's like, okay, it's ready now at the end of the project, and every day that we proceed, it's getting stale. So that's not what happens anymore once we follow this approach. It can be, the results can be continually kept up to date. And so as the relationships and if we can build trust to get, that the interest there, then we can just weave it at the time when it becomes the time. And I think that's the best we can say, because it is important knowledge, and it is also important that everybody feels that it is right to share it publicly, or whatever they may feel.
Right. I like that thought about the speed and these things going stale, because that's what we've seen in the past, where there's been very involved long processes to develop models that are so much dependent on the early stages, that to recreate those models with new data is a huge ordeal and takes too much time to be really very useful in the decision-making process. So that seems like it's a huge advantage of this process. I'm not seeing any more questions.
There's a chat, Matthew Garcia.
Oh, yes, thank you. Matthew Garcia says, regarding finding new integrators and developing expertise, as soon as a scientist learns how to link two or more of those hexagons together, an integrator is born. Those scientists need to be encouraged to expand their work without time pressure, but without heavy risk. Many of us don't branch out that way to become large-scale integrators simply because we are expected to do more than just try to get it to work. Someone wants it soon in order to do something else. There may be enough for us to work on without our current interests. So moving out of that comfort zone needs to be strongly incentivized.
That's a really fantastic point. And, I've had several postdocs working on these projects with me, and that has been a bit of a challenge where, the integrator is has new pressures that may or may not fit perfectly within the publish or perish timeframe. You know, in our research team, we've been able to sort of get through that. We obviously are publishing the pieces that need to be published along the way. I think that real, you know, the integrator stuff, it's going to come where it starts to become, you know, easier to do, and so the time crunch is much less. One of the things that it won't do is alleviate the need to create collaborations. So we certainly have experienced this, that the integrator looks, while they are running the bird model or the caribou model, it doesn't necessarily mean that they understand all the components. So it's really important still to be part of the collaborative team. And that's why, you know, this Western Boreal Initiative had 75 people involved. But a lot of them it was a much lighter weight involvement than a traditional collaboration of 75 people. They didn't have to sort of do the science or the modeling or the projections or whatever. They just had to be part of the sort of a high level conversations about, is this a right interpretation? Is this result seem reasonable? That sort of stuff. And so it really brought the collaboration time way down, because this interface between integrator and specialist. And I guess I'm going a bit off topic from your question now at this point, but these are all great. It's a great question, and we've experienced this pressure about time and specializing versus, you know, broadening.
I think you've made some good points there about the collaborators. To me, there's always that concern when you have pure, I don't know if you call them pure integrators, at least pure modelers involved in using very large scale data sets to do things, but not sort of checking back in with the discipline specialists to understand whether the results that they're seeing are making sense. And I really appreciated that process in the far north in Ontario, that work where we had the folks from the Wildlife Service who have spent a lot of time in the far north, sort of looking at the results and saying, yeah, no, that doesn't make sense, and that does, to sort of give that very important ecological insight that needs to be part of this process. Barry, I think, had a question. He had his hand up, and now he's put it down. I asked him to put it in the chat, but it hasn't shown up. So unless he's typing a really, really long question, which wouldn't surprise me, but I think that's a wrap. I don't see any more questions right now, and we're pretty close to the end of the day. So thanks again, Eliot, for a really, really interesting talk. And I hope that you're open to having people contact you if they have questions about your work. And
yeah, of course.
Would like to discuss it. And thanks everyone for a great day. And please join us at 7 Eastern Daylight tonight for the Aspen trivia and happy hour. Of course, bring your own drink and a snack, and we'll see you there. And thanks everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Lisa, and everybody.